Hello, everybody, and welcome back to This is the Year, the Swiss AI Engineering Podcast. And in today's episode, we will be deep diving into the GPT-5 release that we also covered last week. But in today's video, we go a little bit deeper after doing many experiments. And we also specifically answer the question, well, what is next after GPT-5 was released? Because that seems to be the biggest hype in AI's recent history, and now it's here. So we will be answering that question. At the end of the video, we also do a quick Finance Corner, target particular industry usually, and today we talk about high bandwidth memory and electricity generation. So you're back to the show. The AI engineering wizard is here with us as well. How are you doing in Portugal? In Switzerland, I have like 40 degrees. How is it in Portugal?
I think it's slightly below 40, but it's still quite enough to make us all very sweaty and just be heavily dependent on the AC, which is again very dependent on the electricity, which are the same thing as LLMs. So I may be fighting with Azure or with lesser Anthropic for these watts that I'm spending. But I'll fight till the end to keep my house cool and
to
chill.
Get to the latest gigawatt for your either local machine to run GPT-OSS, that's also a topic for today, or, well, your local AC. When I came back from Bali actually last week, I thought, well, I'm going back to Europe and it's moderately a little bit colder because in Bali was also very hot. Well, here we are, peak performance of the sun also in Europe. So let's get started with the first topics today. We covered it in last week's episode, GPT-5. I saw some additional notions, especially in the news, but also personally speaking, that it might have flopped. I do have my fair bits of feedback after testing it fairly regularly in the last 7 or so days, but what's your first or maybe intermediate feedback, Joao, after using it a few days as well?
I've been testing it mostly for coding. So my use case is, I think, a bit more specific than most people, but it is, I think, a big use case. And it's maintaining the same personality that we mentioned a couple podcasts ago. Like when I use Claude, it tells me what's doing in real time. Like I'm going to change this file, I'm going to look into that. And I just have a real-time description of what's happening. And I asked for GPT-5 to do things, and I've been using it sometimes for features and small changes, and it does them, and it's like relatively good code-wise, but I have no insight on what's happening. So whenever I ask for a bigger change or a bigger feature, I just sit there and wait, and maybe at the end of it, I can look at the code and see what changed. Maybe sometimes it gives me a summary of what changes it decided to do. But while it's doing them, I can see the files changing, but I have no insight from the LLM itself. I just have to read the code myself, which I can. But if I'm using an LLM, I much rather not to, because it's the whole point of using LLMs.
So what's the word you were using after 1 week to sum up the GPT-5 launch? Underwhelming.
Anticlimactic, more of the same. Yeah.
I mean, also from my perspective, just to add my grain of salt to it, I was fairly impressed the first few minutes, especially, well, it has cheaper prices, so that's something worth mentioning. It really came down significantly in pricing. That's probably a strategy to get it more deployed in particular instances. So that's certainly on the plus. On the plus side as well, it's an easier user interface. I believe in the routing mechanisms, because back in the day, just 2-3 weeks ago, I had to choose between 03, 4.1 research, and so on and so forth. Today, I just have one simple UI, and the chatbot basically, or the intent detection works in the sense that it either routes it to GPT-5 or to GPT-5 Deep Thinking, and I don't really have to worry much else as a user. So that's a cleanup as well from a product perspective. On the other side, I have been actually using the voice components as well. Just this morning, I was doing some research into some novel papers. We talked about that before, the reinforcement learning, just the latest on that front. And I believed after like 4 to 7 minutes in conversation, it started to break down. So the voice mode, of course, it's still enhancement. And one particular, well, somewhat a bit cringe aspect that happened, I share with you today as well, that the male voice started to become the female voice and vice versa, especially for a few sentences. And that was kind of a shocking moment because I was interacting with his AI in the particular said voice, and it kept changing the voice, so it felt a little bit, well, I guess, sci-fi, I guess. Have you had this encounter as well, or not?
As the audience may know, every time like a woman starts to talk, Cyril doesn't listen, so he only gets half the answer from ChatGPT, because to him it's just silence in between sentences.
So the nuance.
I think it's like technically and I don't work for OpenAI. I'm not sponsored by them just yet. But I wonder what technically is going on in the background for them to change the voice like that. I mean, it shows that they're actively working on it, as it's not happening across like the user base, but they still have like impending and ongoing issues. And maybe they had those sentences already cached, like for the woman voice, and they decided to just send it out to you because they're trying to save. And I bet that they have a big investment on trying to save as much GPU power as possible.
Probably. So that might be a point. I think something also just to add, maybe on the another plus side of the launch. Yes, the media again, or most people still said it was a flop. To me, it was somewhat of a neutral launch, nothing overly excited, but nothing underwhelming as well. So another positive notion was the ability to run code within the UI. So my workflow, generally speaking, just if I do in quotes vibe coding, I use Versal v0 still for most front-end stuff. But certainly, even if I choose GPT-5 in Versal v0, it doesn't always work. So I do rely also on GPT, my own MacBook Pro version, like the on-device one. And for certain, for example, UI features or just front-end components, I can now pre-run it on GPT-5, and just basically see how it looks like, and then basically iterate there and then paste back the code into Versal v0. So that's kind of, to me, a quick iteration as well, because back in the day with O3, I had to just literally take the code, and I didn't run it basically, and then just copy pasted it back. So that's at least helping on my workflow sometimes on a little bit of front-end vibe coding here and there. Some other model quickly before we go into the subsequent topics. We talked about GPT-OSS last week, and we classified it, maybe also wrongly, because that's what I mostly saw and as kind of a publication is it's open source. Is it open source? Or what's the take here?
I think the technical term that you're looking for is open weights, which, to be fair to us, and like most people using the term, most people don't make that distinction between open weight and open source. But we want to be the most correct podcast in AI. We don't want to give you fake news. So it is open weight, not open source. Because we do have access to the model weights, we can deploy it locally, we can deploy it on a cloud and have it the model as your own. But you can't really know what dataset it was used on and the full training mechanism. So they did not release that data. So by definition, it's not open source. You cannot recreate from scratch GPT-OSS.
So that's,
is that right?
I think it's worth noting, exactly. So they're using the same Apache 2.0 license. You can still run it most of the time if you have an advanced MacBook Pro, for example. You can run it on your local machine. Might not be the fastest for inference, but you can. But yes, you perfectly pointed it out, Joao. I think last week I probably called it 15 times as open source. But in fact, the technical correct definition, if we are a truth-seeking podcast, which we aim to be, it's actually open weight. So just to clarify that, have you played with it? I have not yet. Have you played with it? Or you also left it out?
I've been thinking about it. I haven't. But the thing about this model, and a lot of the models, the top models in the, I'll still call it open source category, it includes open weight ones as well. So locally deployable models. You cannot have GPT-4 or GPT-5 on your computer, simply because they won't allow you to download it. But the downloadable models, the open weight and open source ones, they've been mostly mixer of experts. And we've talked about this architecture. It came up, I think, later last year. And what happens is you have, like I say, these massive models with maybe 200, 300 billion parameters, but they're not all being used. So it's the equivalent of having smaller models, like smaller LLMs, all grouped into one. And then whenever you run something, only part of those LLMs are active at a given moment. And so you have sometimes 300 billion parameters, which would not fit your MacBook, but of the 300 billion parameters, maybe 80 are active, or maybe 20 are active. And those definitely fit on your memory. And you can just change what is active, what's not active, and run it on devices. That's why Sam Altman tweeted that you can run it, maybe the smaller of the GPT-OSS models, because there are two. The smaller one, you can maybe run it on a high-end phone, because it does fit inside a memory if you just account for the active weights. And I'm looking forward to it because I don't have commercial-grade GPUs at home. If I did, I would pay to the nose just on power alone, and I'll also not be able to get them. NVIDIA has a back order of many, many companies who have a bigger budget than I do. But for these open weight and open source ones, being mixer of experts allows me to run it locally. So it allows people with not commercial grade software and commercial grade hardware on their homes to actually run it. And from what I've seen on the benchmarks across people talking about locally deployable models, it is a pretty good one. I mean, it is one of the top choices at the moment. It is beating DeepSeek R1, and most people by now know DeepSeek. It's beating both of its versions, so R1 had a slight update, and it's still beating that one. So I'm pretty glad that OpenAI launched the model, because we did suspect they would launch a mediocre model just for PR purposes. But so far, it's one of the better launches they've done this year.
It's certainly something to keep an eye out. And we will probably be testing it also from our end in the next few days, few weeks. Something you mentioned before, just a few minutes ago, was personality in the models. I stumbled across this particular interesting paper by Anthropic Research in conjunction with some other institutions, but it's around the notion of AIs having personality. We did mention that a few episodes ago already. I can always not pronounce this particular word, but on psychopathy. So the notion of how agreeable a model is, basically, it just says yes to whatever you're aiming it to do. And the paper basically, just to wrap up quickly the context and to basically lay out the foundation. Basically, before you ship an LLM, a large language model, as an agent, you fine-tune it or you make it reinforced that it's basically acting as an assistant in the best helpful, in the best supportive, the best positive notion. But of course, you might have encountered that as well. It does hallucinate. It might be too agreeable, or it might actually be evil, like we've seen with Grok 4. Well, I'm not going into much detail, but there was something regarding Hitler. And in this particular paper, they outlined basically a new steering mechanisms, these so-called persona vectors, without going too much into the math behind that. And I just thought that's an interesting notion, that we do have these new LLMs. They do have some sort of in-baked and ingrained training data, and that might have some sort of bias in it or actually yield to a particular personality. I don't know where you're standing on this, Joao. Have you seen, used, or actually leveraged these personality positively or negatively, or what's your take on AI personalities?
I mean, I've built some agents that are already in production, and especially for those ones facing the public. So when companies have the software that anyone can use, they focus a lot on the tone that the LLM has. So you don't want to have an assistant that's the face of your company available on your website, anyone can use, and it's, let's say, disagreeable, or it says something offensive. Like if you're Elon Musk and you're running XAI, then maybe that's fine, that's passable. You can just hire a PR firm and say it's all meme. But if you're a normal company with normal goals, you don't want that. So a lot of people, and myself included, because the business needs were there, spend a lot of time refining prompts, saying I could be more polite in these cases, be less polite in some other cases, which is not only like a mess and something that takes up your time, but also can impact the quality of your answers. So if you're building these agents and you want them to be super correct, like super polite, and then you want them to actually answer questions, and you say, hey, you have to answer them really briefly, like don't be super verbose, don't be talking about half an hour about something, just give them the quickest direct answer possible. That's what users want. And what I found is there's this clash of, if you ask it to be polite and you ask it to be brief, then you can't really do both, because it sees being polite as adding more words to the sentence, saying, hey, thank you for, like, what a wonderful question, let me answer that for you. And that's not brief. And so if you have a way to control that tonality and be consistent about it, and you don't have to spend as many tokens, so you don't have to write as big of a prompt to get the same personality, I see that as a very positive feature. And Anthropic has been working on alignment and making sure the LLMs are more human-like as possible, so they can integrate better and they have like the same goals as us. Just in case that one of them goes rogue, I am seeing this as a very useful feature for the near future.
So just to repeat, in other words, so basically currently, like you would need to basically be deploying prompts to basically be having this steerability. And the paper, as outlined, maybe just the full name is Persona Vectors, Monitoring and Controlling Character Traits in Language Models. Again, they're proposing the persona vectors itself as a steerability measure. So that might be a new gateway for you to actually steer the models towards the particular characteristics that you're aiming to have. If it's a publicly facing solution or even internal stakeholder facing solution like an agent or any other, let's say, workflow tool that some sort of has AI in the background, you would want to have maybe a particular tone and that is now steerable. We've also seen, just to reiterate from GPT-5's API, that there is an API parameter called verbosity. Would you say, maybe best estimate, Joao, that these persona vectors are coming into some sort of configuration or parameterization, or that might be a separate, let's say, that's only accessible to the model providers?
I mean, hopefully for at least the open source ones, you'd have this same ability of using these persona vectors and the parameters to control and have fine-grained control over things. Because if you're building these systems, and most of the times you're building multi-agent systems where each agent has a different task and different tools, some agents are supposed to be more verbose than others. And you don't want to refine your prompts and say, actually, just say 2 sentences instead of 1. Actually write the whole paragraph or write a whole chapter. It's hard, from my experience, it's hard to get the verbosity right just by prompting. There's no direct way to ask for 4 exact sentences, because most of the times LLMs are going to ignore you and do whatever number of sentences they feel like. And so having these persona vectors and these parameters is coming in like a wonderful time to actually build these agents, because it gives you that access, that control. I'm not sure if it's going to be seen across the board. So these 2 parameters for verbosity, I think, are mostly on OpenAI side. You can control how much it reasons, and I think that's something Google already has, but the verbosity is a new one. So Anthropic is doing persona vectors, OpenAI is doing these parameters on their API. Maybe you'll see both joined together, or maybe you see entirely distinct and different approaches. And this persona thing matters. I think most users don't know, but OpenAI spent weeks, maybe months, of like teams dedicated to the personality of GPT-5. Because there was, and we talked about it on a podcast, a big movement against the psychophancy of GPT-4o. Like, whatever you ask, oh, what a great question, let me answer that for you. Oh, you're so smart, that's like a novel idea that no one ever had. You're literally a genius. And you would say this to mostly anyone, and especially if you replied positively to that, you enforce that behavior. And they spent weeks to make GPT-5 more neutral, and they announced it like how it has like a more correct personality. It's more adaptable to a corporate setting. Like, it won't be as sycophant. It won't reinforce, like if you're saying something entirely stupid, it won't say it's a good idea. And that's a good thing. But right away, people started asking for GPT-4o back, because they somehow really loved having that validation. I mean, it makes sense on a world where TikTok is like as successful as it is, but seeing people cry out for having their old models back, because OpenAI also announced that there'll be disposing of legacy models, and they're gonna be using GPT-5, like the most recent models, exclusively. And some people, not everyone, but some people went nuts for it, and they really wanted that sycophant model back. And maybe we'll see this persona vectors be useful to keep that persona around for some people.
The reconfirmation. I mean, today I tested it. I believe it's still somewhat high on that notion, but it's certainly a concept to have a look at. Again, I will link the research paper, which just was published a few days ago by Anthropic, UC Berkeley, and some other contributors. I think it's a fairly interesting new phenomena. Once again, we do have these personality traits seemingly in these models, and we don't always want them, because it might not be the best user experience or even agentic experience if you have that baked into the models and you can't steer it properly as well. So let's talk about what's next. Just to set the stage once again, we did reach GPT-5. It is summer 2025. Where are we going from here, Joao? I do have some sort of playing field. What might be next? Should I start, or do you want to kick it off? After GPT-5, what nuggets are we looking forward to now?
I think my best educated guess from what I've been seeing so far, and I've been tracking like these releases of LLMs, it's still going to happen. You're still going to see a lot of open source ones and open weight ones. You're still going to see some closed source LLMs coming out. I hope OpenAI is going to cut back on the hype that it did for the GPT-5, because we've been having this like amount of hype from some Altman build up OpenAI for 3 models ago. So they launched entire models in the meanwhile, and they were still hyping GPT-5. So you had models, and you're always looking forward for the next one, for when GPT-5 is coming out. And they were just creating this, talking about AGI, talking about this is the Death Star, or being the Manhattan Project of some Altman, like him acting like he was scared of his capabilities, while in reality, and like a good model comparable to Grok 4, comparable to Anthropic Cloud 4.1, it's on par in most of benchmarks. Maybe a bit above in some, maybe a bit below in others. Like, it's a good model, but it didn't break anyone's mind. And so I think everyone got collectively disappointed at OpenAI. And it's be very hard for them to hype anything else at the moment, because if they do, like, oh, GPT-6 is going to be amazing, and people are going to say, I don't think I believe you, because you said that before.
I mean, it's just maybe the general notion that the model progress is somewhat flattening as we are reaching the max percentage of most of these benchmarks. If you have 98% in one benchmark and 98.7% in another, it's just generally speaking that we're approaching these plateaus. Humanity's last exam, I think it's still maybe the last benchmark that we're only reaching like 40s. I think high 40s for Grok and mid to low 40s for GPT-5, which is commonly known as like the most difficult exam to like know to humanity, generally speaking, and especially the models haven't seen and could not have been trained on the data in these tests. That's at least the claim of humanity's last exam. My notion, especially for the future, just to rehype from a different perspective.
You're going to be the new Sam Altman to
I'm
hype
just going to be
up.
Always very, very optimistic on where we are going. To put things into perspective, when I started with AI, which was in summer 2023, especially putting stuff in production, back then it was mostly image models working. So that's also why we built this mini SaaS back then. Post that, chatbots were starting to emerge. So that was like the first actual text-based solution that you can interact with a chatbot. So that we accomplished now. We accomplished probably most likely with GPT-5 the reasoners, deep thinking, a few minutes. We talked about it last week, a few hours, 24 or 48 hours reasoning, meaning deep thinking. I think these two, let's say, hills we climbed. What's in front of us now, especially with GPT-5, the new Claudes and the Groks of the world, and the open source, maybe from China and from hopefully Llama in the future as well again, are the agents. So these agentic systems are really probably what's on the horizon in 2025, 2026. We did bring that up multiple times, but it's probably really about, again, employing LangChain, LangGraph, MCPs, equipping these agents with tools and automating as much of, for example, a human workflow as possible while still having a human in the loop. That's probably the stage we are at. And the hype now, probably for the future, is the innovators and then the organizations. First, the innovators. What is an innovator? Probably on the horizon in, what should we say, 72 months, something like that. In a few years, maybe in 2 years, there will be AI systems, most likely that are coming up with new ideas, maybe in mathematics, maybe in physics, maybe in medicine, and most likely also in business. New software, new algorithms, new, for example, treatments to particular diseases, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really the frontier that most people are probably looking at now, but it's not on the horizon in 2026. Or would you disagree with that? The innovators are already out next year, or what do you think?
I mean, it can help you do research. It can help you if you have a team or if you're doing it by yourself. It's a massive, massive help, especially because it integrates so well with so many different platforms. I've had a friend using Claude Max, which is this Anthropic tool that you can install, and it's mostly like on a terminal, so it doesn't have any fancy graphics, but only using text. Like you have a simple text-based interaction. He configured access to his email account, to his calendar, to like his code base, and he's doing all his work with never almost touching any of this platform. So he doesn't log into Gmail, he doesn't log into Gyro, he doesn't log in to the platforms that usually when I start my day, I open all 7 tabs. He just opens his terminal and say, hey, see what I have to do today. Check me out this, go online and search for this, and it does it. So I think it's not only the LLM that's super smart, and Anthropic Claude 4.1 is maybe the least publicly hyped one, because Anthropic doesn't do hyping. It's going the exact opposite direction of Sam Altman's OpenAI, but it's a very good model and it can do those things, but also the integration. So like the MCP servers and MCP tools it has, you can just add your own, and there's a lot of them already available. You can just connect to whatever platform you're using. So if you're using your Notion notes, if you're using some weird calendar app, if it doesn't have MCP servers, it will in the very near future, or you can just build your own. And it does all the work by itself. I think it'll free up a lot of I'd say the boring tasks that you were doing in your day-to-day, if you do it right, to actually be able to innovate. Even if it doesn't come up with new ideas by itself, now you have free time to think about them. Maybe it'll come up empty. Maybe you'll spend the rest of your day looking at the wall, waiting for something. But it can suggest and it can act as a bouncing board for you to try out your ideas. And maybe if it's not...
It frees up time to do stuff that you like, right?
And it's important not to be so sycophantic, because if you're trying to bounce off ideas and get real feedback, you don't want to hear, what a great, amazing idea that's going to revolutionize the world for every single idea you have. I doubt they're all going to be that amazing. So it's good to have the kind of a refined persona that OpenAI tried to do with GPT-5.
So generally speaking, you are saying, but just to explain it in different words, the agents, they're already here from a private perspective, but also from a corporate perspective. It's probably the year for that. And not yet next year, there will be an LLM, a large language model, that's coming up with new original ideas. Or are you saying maybe next year that already might be the case?
Will they have to see massive improvements on the technology that we have to have better models? Because I think we can make them bigger, but they won't fit any hardware, or they'll be prohibitively expensive to run. So unless NVIDIA or any other GPU companies come up with some new form of hardware, or software developers come up with new architectures for these models, we won't see that big of a leap in LLM capabilities. Like, it's coming to a plateau, it's getting better, but it's not getting that better that fast. But it'll certainly be way more capable and able to do things you're doing day to day by itself, without your interaction or without spending your time on things.
I mean, at the end of the day, these multiple billions, they probably have to hit the productivity curve at some point that the hyperscalers and the whole model providers invested. I think this is the year for that as well. So that's certainly something I'm personally very excited that I have an ingrained system in my MacBook Pro that does most of the boring tasks. Do that, send the email, get my calendar up and running, open these particular websites, do this and that. That's certainly something that frees my time up personally. But then from a corporate perspective, we talked about the agents. And then in 72 months, maybe a bit later, after GPT-5, of course, came out now, it might be the innovators on the horizon. The last frontier, just that's already mostly sci-fi here now, is the best estimate that AIs are capable to run an entire vertical, for example, an entire business, by itself, to delegate to other AIs, or maybe to delegate to humans. So the brain of a company or the leader of a company might be an AI. Actually, last semester in one of my classes, we actually did some research on that particular notion. So the leaders are the AIs now, and how is the human interaction actually happening? That was some interesting stuff. That was already last year that we delved into that. To look into the future, there are so many exciting things on the horizon for AI. We do have still power shortage. We do still have chip shortage. We do still have huge opportunities in building these agentic systems for different verticals. I'm thinking about medicine, law, finance. There's so many different ones that haven't been touched actually by SaaS before, or now by AI. So there's certainly the time with ChatGPT-5 and the other cutting-edge models to start building and implementing solutions in a secure and reliable manner. So let's switch gears a little bit into the wrap-up on the finance corner. Do you want to do the intro, Joao, or should I do it on the finance corner? Usually I do it, but you do
My
it
intro is that my stocks, my ideas, are not doing as well as I thought they would be doing. And when I look at the AI stocks that I have, and the AI companies and hardware companies, they're all performing way better than I expected. So Cyril's ideas seem to be way better than mine. I think that's my intro.
Term.
In the short term, at least. I'm still big on power. I still think it's going to be, and it is like a big need of the world, and companies who are capable of actually fulfilling that demand of power and build the infrastructure to the power plants and the distribution network to actually have power delivered not only to millions of homes, but to millions of infrastructure and data centers will be very, very profitable. But it's hard to pick out which ones they'll be. But I'll leave that to Cyril, because he's done his due diligence, he's done the work, the research, and he'll give you not legally defined as financial advice, because that would be, again, illegal, but he's going to talk about stocks in a way that maybe you, if you want, you can also invest
just
like him.
For educational purposes only.
Only educational purposes, exactly.
Exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the notion of electricity demand is not really, I think, achieved the saturation of the entire public. Most of the people I probably think are not aware that the sheer amount of power we might need, especially if we scale up compute, scale up reasoning, scale up data centers across the world, that we might actually need, as your investing thesis currently shows, really this energy production. And there is also always a notion on the mix of energy. For example, fusion versus solar versus nuclear versus hydro versus nat gas and so on and so on. Coal also, even though I'm not a big fan of that, but dirty energy, maybe a little bit, that which is the mix that's achievable. There are certain energy providers that can build up faster. I think China is mostly very much advanced on the nuclear, especially these generation 4 reactors, which we don't have yet in the West. So there is these, I think, degrees of freedom in the energy, let's say, generation landscape, but there's certainly investment opportunities there. What you were referring to before, and these are maybe just the two stocks I quickly can name, Micron and the Labs. They're basically building this foundation and glue between the GPUs. So NVIDIA's, I think, is a prominent name, the NVIDIA's of the world, the AMD's of the world. But really, this is like glue in between these chips is really becoming an interesting facet. Broadcom, Micron, Lumentum, Astera Labs. These are like the companies that are providing the glue. Beyond that is maybe TSMC. That's also certainly, still pushing the frontiers. They're investing heavily in the States. But that's probably just a quick update. The reason why I bring Micron up today is because they did update the forecast, which had a quick effect on the stock as well. So it's still somewhat reasonable to assume that high bandwidth memory is required more than we expected, or at least that the analysts expected at the beginning of the year because of the reasoning components. Because when a model thinks a long time, we might need to offload a few of the reasoning steps, and this is somewhat sitting in a memory. So that's some sort of the notion there. Astera has a different approach as well, so that's maybe a little bit of a smaller company, but probably these two I would highlight today just for everybody in the audience, only for educational purposes only, to have a look at.
Yeah.
And maybe do your own inference there.
I mean, we've been talking about these AI agents, and they've been getting more capable with more tools. And one of the new features from ChatGPT is using the browser and using, I think, a virtual version of the browser and logging into websites, doing things for you. So it doesn't even need a direct tool for a certain platform. You can just go on the browser and use that platform with clicks and the keyboard like you would. If you have that workflow, if you have it going to the browser, clicking on something, getting the data, and writing an email, all that process, you can call it reasoning, you can call it a workflow, that's gonna go into memory. So GPT-5 has a bigger context window than GPT-4 did. Gemini still has way bigger context window than any of those two. We are seeing, and we're going to be seeing, bigger and bigger context windows from these models. And these context windows mean that they need to have the memory to actually store all this data, to actually deploy the model and have all the tokens for the reasoning, all the tokens for the input, and all the tokens for the output stored, because it's running some processes, it's running calculations on that memory. So it does make sense, it does track that the memory need of the world may increase.
It's still,
Again,
it's still a bit of a floppy hypothesis, because generally speaking, I think the memory market had very low margins. And unless you have like some sort of software stack on top of the memory system, that you can actually defend maybe a certain element of the margin. So that's why I believe Micron, SK Hynix, these two companies were always a bit in the 50-50 split if it's an interesting AI company or if it's simply a memory or DRAM production company. So I leave that out in the world. I don't know. I have my own kind of reasoning. I don't have 90% of my money in either of these two companies, but it might certainly be something that's interesting to have a look at. Anything else from your side today, or you're good to wrap up the episode?
I have to talk about this. Otherwise, Benny will come back eventually and he'll hit me in the head, or he'll just mock me relentlessly for not hyping this up. I'm not Sam Altman, but I'm pretty sure I should hype this because it's not as much in the public as it should be. It's more in the research circles, but it will reach the public, I think, in the very near future, which is Google's new research model called Genie 3. So they've had similar these models like before. Genie 3 is way better than the previous ones. And to give you an idea what it can do, it's not LLM. They call it a world model. So it can generate a world in real time for you, like a game that you can interact with. So it can be super realistic or more blocky like Minecraft. You can just decide what kind of world you want it to be in. Maybe you're inside a house, maybe you're in the middle of the desert. And it can create a character for you in that world, or it can do a first-person view, and you can walk in that world. You can interact with the world. In that demo that they showed, like inside a house, you could paint a wall. And if you look away and you look back at the wall, it's still painted. So they add this thing called the world memory. So what changes you build into the world remain in the world, which makes it pretty much like a game. And it's just amazing that it's just born out of a single model. Like, I'm sure there's like a lot of inside and smaller models to make it work, but they're packaging as a one single entity that does all these things. Like it generates the thing for you. If you're walking, like one of the demos I showed, like you're walking toward the street, there's a river beside you, and they write a prompt saying, hey, make a jet ski go by, like a guy in a jet ski. And a jet ski does go by you, and you can look at it, and you can turn, and you see the ripples in the water. Like, it's surprisingly realistic for something that's being generated in real time. And I just advise you, and I'm begging Cyril to put the link in the description for you to go see what Genie 3 is capable of. I mean, it's just nuts. And I think people use it for a lot of nefarious purposes. I think it'll create a bit of propaganda, and because you can create any kind of world you want to, but you can also use it for a lot of fun stuff and bring some joy to the world.
I think it's a good time to wrap up, especially these interactive models and, real world models, maybe coupled with augmented reality or even virtual reality might be the next frontier that we are heading into. Certainly. Thank you, Joao. I almost forgot it today to bring it up. Great. So just for the audience, once again, we do these episodes every single week. Today was a bit of a retrospective episode on GPT-5, but we thought it makes sense to once again go a little bit deeper into some things we missed last week, and then really to look ahead what is next. Once again, I wrap up. We talked about chatbots. We talked about reasoners. Now it's the time of agents. This is the year for agents. And next, or maybe the subsequent years, might be the time and the years for innovators. And then who knows? AI is running each and every single org. Maybe not. We are still here as humans. So see you in the next episode. Joao, thanks for joining once again, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
See you next week.